Hi, I'm John and welcome to Half Dozen Homestead. Today we are canning chicken. Last night I processed a couple of our roosters. We've got too many roosters and so they got to sit in the fridge all day and chill. So I've got 4 roosters that are like a dual purpose sort of bird, and then I still have some other soup chickens and some chickens that have been in the freezer a little bit longer than we would have liked. And before that meat starts to spoil and get freezer burnt and all that, we're going to process it up and can it. We're using 1 liter mason jars, wide mouth. The wide mouth really just makes it easy for us to be able to load the containers as well as empty them when it comes time to needing them. Okay, here's our bird. And I'm just going to part them up like I would part up any one of my birds. Typically bust the hips open a little bit. Got the leg here. It's a nice dark meat. And this fat joint right here, that's where you run your knife. And if you run it just right, you'll actually cut right through the joint and you won't catch the bone. Got my 2 mini drums. My 2 breasts, and that is 1 full jar of chicken. By the time it cooks down, it's going to shrink like crazy and all the liquids will come out of it. But 1 chicken to 1 jar, not bad. The carcasses, you can save them for a whole bunch of different things. So we'll often use them to make broth, that sort of stuff. Or every once in a while when we've got too much broth and we've got a freezer full of chicken, we won't use it and we will actually feed that back to the chickens. It's really good protein for them and it'll really help them. They'll get nicer feathers, they'll look a lot better. When you're cutting the leg, there is a chunk of muscle on the back here, and that's usually a beginner mistake is you've missed that chunk of meat. What we're doing with canning, you can cut anything out afterwards. We'll never eat these by pulling a leg out and eating the whole leg. By the time this is canned, the meat is fall off the bone. So when we go to use it for a recipe, we just take it out and shred whatever's, we shred it and then we're done. So when it comes to taking the breast off, there is a breast bone and then the Y bone here. And so typically what I do is run my knife. Ideally I have a sharper knife than what I've got. And I run it all the way down the breastbone to the end. And then I do the same thing on the other side. And this is just setting you up to make the rest of taking the breast off easier. There's a fat line here, and that shows you where the bottom of the breast meat is. So what I'll do, I try to do it so you can see, but it's awkward. Normally I grab the meat, and I pull the meat as I carefully slice. This way I'm able to get right tight to the rib cage, not waste any meat. Again, if you end up cutting a little bit of breast meat out with a chicken wing, great, or a little bit of chicken wing with the breast meat, doesn't matter. That's a pretty small breast, but I got everything off here. There's a little bit left in here that I'll cut out in a minute. And same thing on the other side. We're taking the wing off. I sort of go underneath the armpit, along the back, and that just sort of loosens up the muscle on the back there. Then I ride it until I find that joint, and just try to go right between the joint. So I've got 7 jars packed. That's how many fit in the pressure canner. So at this point, I'm going to finish cleaning up my surfaces, clean up my stuff, and then Rachel's going to take over from here. Rachel was pregnant, I think, with Nathaniel, and raw chicken grossed her right out. And since then, handling it is not her favorite thing. So I have no problem parting these birds up, getting them all in here, but when it comes to the canning side of things, she's the queen of canning, and I'm gonna let her show you the last little step in the process. And then I think because she's gotta hang out while it pressure cans, she's gonna make some sort of sauce, but I'll let her explain that to you.
Okay, so John's got the jars filled with raw chicken because we're going to do the raw pack method for canning our chicken. So he just filled it to leave about 1 1/4 inch of headspace in each jar. And now I'm just going to get the jars ready to put in the canner. So all I'm going to do for that is add 1 teaspoon of salt per jar. I use kosher salt, or sometimes I use canning salt. It just depends on what I have on hand, as long as it's not table salt. The salt is purely for flavor. It has nothing to do with the actual food preservation. Okay, what I'm going to do next is just wipe the rim. With most foods, I'll just use like a wet cloth. But since it's meat and it's a bit greasy, I'm just going to use a paper towel, put a bit of vinegar, just white vinegar on it, and that'll just clean the rim of anything greasy, because if there's anything greasy left on the rim, you risk the jar not sealing. So now I'm just going to put a lid and a rim on each jar. And just tighten each jar to fingertip tight. So each of my jars has a lid on it. Now I'm just going to get the canner ready. So to get the pressure canner ready, I'm just going to put 3 quarts of water into the pressure canner. And since the jars and the meat are cold, I'm going to use cold water. You always want to use water temperature that matches the temperature of the food. What's funny?
You're making me smile.
You're not making me smile. Stop it. Go away. So my pressure canner manual says to put 3 quarts of water in. There's also like lines on the inside of the pot. So I just fill it to the bottom line, which is the 3 quart mark. Actually overfilled it a bit, I think. Empty a tiny bit.
We'll edit this up.
So my pressure canner came with a canning rack that goes in the bottom of the pot, so it just sits in there. It's important to use that when you're canning. It's just, if the jars jostle around at all, it just protects them. Now that I've got my water in there, I'm going to go ahead and put the jars in. Go ahead and put the lid on and then lock it closed. And I have it on the largest burner that my stove has. And I'm just going to turn the burner on to high. Okay, while the chicken is canning, I have to be in the kitchen anyways to monitor the pressure dial on the pressure canner. So I'm just going to do another canning project while I'm in here anyways. I'm going to make a recipe called red hot sauce. So it'll be a nice homemade hot sauce made with our homegrown tomatoes and our homegrown hot peppers. So I'm just going to start off by coring each tomato. So I just have, this is called a strawberry huller. It's like a special scoop tool that's got like sharp teeth, and it works really well for just scooping the core right out of the tomato. So that's all I'm doing with each tomato, is just taking the core out, and then I'll chop it up to get it ready for the recipe. The recipe actually calls for the skins to come off as well. But since I'm going to be pureeing everything together at the end anyways, I'm just going to leave the skins on because I have a high-powered blender. It'll save me some time and you won't even be able to notice that the skins are there. That's all of the tomatoes that I have. These are all my ripe tomatoes right now. The recipe calls for 8 cups of chopped tomatoes. I think I probably have, well, definitely more than that. I don't know if twice as much, but I might need to double the recipe, but that's okay. Okay, I've got my tomatoes cored, so I'm just gonna chop them up and put them in my measuring cup. I'll fill that up, and then I'll put them in my pot, and I'll see how many I have total. So I'm just gonna roughly chop them.
What type of tomatoes are you using?
So these are Roma tomatoes, which is what the recipe calls for. Use Roma tomatoes because they're very fleshy. They don't have a lot of as much water in them as other types of tomatoes, so you'll end up with a thicker sauce. Okay, so that is my third 8-cup measure. So I'm actually gonna have to triple the recipe. Okay, so I've had the canner on high heat for quite a while now. The jars were cold, so it takes a little while for it to heat up. Once there is a steady stream coming out of the port here, then you need to set your timer for 10 minutes. Let the steam escape for 10 minutes. Once it's escaped for 10 minutes, then I can put the weight on. Okay, so our timer's gone off. It's been 10 minutes that I've been venting the steam. So I'm just going to go ahead and put the weight on there now. With the weight being on there, that'll allow the pressure to build. And to can the meat, I want to can it at 11 pounds pressure. So I'll just wait until the dial gets up to 11 pounds and then I can start my timer. So I've got my red chili peppers ready. So these are just an assortment of, these are actually Hungarian yellow hot peppers, but I just let them get riper so they turn red. And I've got some red jalapenos, and then I've also got some red serrano peppers as well, which are basically like a smaller jalapeno. So I'm just going to use an assortment of peppers. I'm going to take the seeds out before I measure them. It's just personal preference. You can leave the seeds in if you prefer something hotter, because that's where the heat tends to be. So to take the seeds out, I just cut it in half lengthwise, and then just pull the seeds out. Doesn't have to be perfect. Just try to get out as many seeds as you can. I've got the canner up to 11 pounds of pressure. So I'm going to set my timer, and since it's bone-in chicken, I'm going to set the timer for 75 minutes. So I'm just roughly chopping my hot red peppers so that I can measure them. Since I'm tripling the recipe calls for 1.5 cups of hot peppers. Since I'm tripling it, I'll be doing 4.5 cups. Almost there. I'm just going to add 1 habanero for the entire recipe. Okay, I've got my 4.5 cups of hot peppers. Add that. Okay, so the recipe for this hot sauce says to put the tomatoes and chili peppers in the pot and add 2 cups of vinegar and bring it to a boil, but since I'm tripling the recipe, I'm going to add 6 cups of vinegar.
Is there garlic in there?
Yeah, I added a clove of garlic.
Does the recipe call for garlic?
No.
You're addicted to garlic?
Garlic, and I just have this thing where almost any recipe I just have to like tweak it a little bit. So the recipe calls for pickling spice to be added to the sauce. I'm not really a huge fan of the flavor of pickling spice, but I love mustard seeds, so I'm just gonna make a little spice bag with just mustard seeds for seasoning in the hot sauce. So to do that, I'm just putting some mustard seeds in a square of cheesecloth and just tying it up. That'll be added to the sauce later. Okay, so I've boiled the hot sauce, tomatoes, and peppers for about 15 minutes. It says to boil about 15 minutes or until the vegetables start to soften, so they look pretty softened. So now I'm gonna run it through my blender. The timer's gone off. It's been 75 minutes, so I'm gonna turn off the heat. And then we're gonna take the pot off of the burner to cool. So I pureed all of my tomato and pepper mixture. So now I'm gonna put it back on the stove, bring it back to a boil. And this is the point where I add the sugar. So it's 1 cup of sugar per recipe. So I'm gonna put 3 cups of sugar total. And then I'm gonna add my spice bag and 1 tablespoon of salt per recipe. So a total of 3 tablespoons. And I'll just give it a stir. And I'll just stir it occasionally while it comes back up to a boil. So I brought the mixture back up to a boil. So now I'm gonna add the remaining vinegar. So it's the last 2 cups of vinegar per recipe. Once it comes back up to a boil, I'll turn down the heat and I'll let it simmer. And it says just to let it simmer until it thickens up to about the consistency of a commercial ketchup, or about 45 minutes. So the pressure has come completely down in the canner. You can see by the pressure gauge is at 0 and the pin in the back has dropped. So now that the pressure is all the way down, I'm gonna take the pressure regulator weight off of there. So it's been 10 minutes since I took the weight off of the pressure valve. So now I'm gonna take the lid off. And now I can take my jars out of the canner, so I'm just going to put them on a towel on the counter to cool. So now that I've taken the jars out of the canner, I'll leave them on the counter to cool. I'll leave them there for about 12 to 24 hours until they're completely cool and sealed. At that point, I'll take the rings off the jars and just give them a wipe. They tend to be like a little bit greasy after they come out of the canner. So that's pretty much it. I'm really looking forward to having some more home-canned, homegrown chicken on the shelf. It is so convenient. It's just really delicious and tender. So that's it. Look at all that beautiful broth. It just cans the chicken in its own broth, which makes it like just so tender and flavorful. So our hot sauce is just about at the consistency that I want it to be at. Still a little bit thin, but it's almost there. So I'm gonna go ahead and get the canning pot ready with all of my jars. So to do that, I'll just put my jars. I'm just gonna use jelly jars, like just the 1 cup size jars. I'll just put them in my canning pot. And then I'll just fill the canning pot with water and bring it up to a boil. It'll sterilize the jars and make them nice and hot, and I want them hot so that they match the temperature of the liquid that I'm going to be pouring into them. Once I have the water in here, I'm going to add a small splash of vinegar. I like to do that just because we have well water, and if you don't put vinegar in there, the vinegar kind of like softens the water. Without it, then you kind of end up with like a white film on the jars just from the hard water deposits. The recipe says to boil it down to a consistency of about like a commercial ketchup. It says in the recipe it should take about 45 minutes, but it's been more like 2 hours. And probably still not quite there, but I think we're gonna just leave it like it is because I'm tired of waiting 45 minutes in my butt. But I'm just gonna give a little taste test. Pretty good. You wanna try some? Come here. That wasn't, you didn't even get any, you baby. Come here.
It's hot.
It's not that hot.
It's like spicy ketchup.
Yeah, it does kind of taste like spicy ketchup. So I'm just going to fill a few jars at a time, that way the jars stay hot. And as I fill them, I can stick them back in the canner. There's 14 jars in total, which is all that will fit. I still have a little bit left over. I'll probably put that in the fridge and deal with it later. I'm just going to put the lid on the canner and water bath, I think, for 15 minutes. So the timer went off. The water bath can for 15 minutes. After that, I turned the burner off and I moved them over to a cool burner and took the lid off for 5 minutes. So now they're ready to come out of the canner. So there's 14 jars of hot sauce plus some in the fridge that I'll figure out what to do with later. Yeah, so I doubt we'll go through 14 jars of hot sauce in a year, but it'll make really great gifts. And I'm just happy that I can make it with our homegrown tomatoes and peppers. Thanks for watching Half Dozen Homestead.